Never judge a book by its cover, because the quietest person in the room might just be the one with the most power. That lesson hit hard for two arrogant airline employees at Pine Haven Regional Airport. And by the time they realized who they were mocking, it was already too late. It was supposed to be just another routine afternoon at the airport. Travelers bustled through the terminals, some hauling oversized suitcases, others sipping coffee while waiting for delayed flights. And among them, a well-dressed black woman moved with quiet confidence, pulling a modest carry-on behind her. Nothing flashy, no entourage, just a gray pantsuit, a simple black purse slung over her shoulder, and a subtle gold necklace resting against her collarbone. To Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks, two bored Reynolds Aviation employees at the baggage counter, she looked like just another middle-aged woman traveling alone. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that behind those polite smiles and unassuming presence stood Clara Johnson, a two-term United States Senator from Michigan. But in their eyes, she was invisible until they decided to make her a target. Clara had always preferred to travel light, no press, no security detail. It reminded her of where she came from, humble beginnings in a working-class neighborhood of Detroit, where her parents ran a small auto repair shop and taught her the value of hard work, dignity, and resilience. She carried that with her into every space she entered, including the Senate floor. And today, she carried it right into Pine Haven Regional Airport. Her day had already been long. A packed morning of town hall meetings, endless phone calls, and now a race to catch her flight to Westfield City for an emergency economic reform committee hearing. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just the basic courtesy extended to any passenger. But as she approached the Reynolds Aviation baggage counter, she felt the shift immediately. Eric glanced up lazily as Clara greeted him with a polite, "Good afternoon," and handed over her reservation details. Without a word or even eye contact, he grunted, "ID." Clara calmly retrieved her driver's license and passed it over. Meanwhile, Madeline barely looked up, too busy chuckling at something on her phone. Then came the smirk. "First class, huh?" Eric muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. Clara simply nodded. "That's correct." What started as subtle disrespect quickly turned into open mockery. They exchanged looks, snickers, and dismissive glances, as if a black woman like Clara could never belong in first class unless she had cheated the system. What they didn't realize was that hidden in Clara's purse was something that could destroy their smug little power trip, a United States Senate ID card carrying the full weight of the nation behind it. And before this flight was over, they were going to find out exactly who they'd been laughing at. Eric Simmons' snort was subtle, but loud enough for Clara Johnson to catch. He glanced at Madeline Brooks, barely suppressing a smirk. "Well, look at that," Eric muttered, staring at the screen. "First class, huh?" Clara nodded, her voice calm. "That's correct. I booked it myself." She had done this countless times before, flying first class when work demanded quiet space to review sensitive documents. But this time felt different. There was a chill in Eric's voice, a clear undercurrent of disbelief, as if the very idea of a black woman like Clara sitting in first class was somehow offensive. Madeline finally peeled her eyes from her phone, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "First class," she echoed, barely containing a giggle. "Must be nice." She didn't even try to hide the sarcasm. Clara's brows furrowed, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of reacting. In politics, she'd faced worse. Blatant disrespect from powerful men who underestimated her. But something about being belittled by two bored airline employees at the Reynolds Aviation counter struck a nerve. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Clara asked, her tone level but firm. No problem," Eric mumbled, though his voice said otherwise. He slapped the baggage tag onto her suitcase and shoved it toward her. "You'll need to take that over to the oversized drop over there." He pointed vaguely toward the far end of the counter, making it very clear he had no intention of assisting her further. Madeline let out another laugh, quiet but cruel. Clara's jaw tightened as she took her bag. Still, she swallowed her anger. There was no winning a fight here. Not yet. She reminded herself courtesy was a two-way street, but some people simply refuse to meet you halfway. But deep down, Clara knew this wasn't over. Not yet. After double-checking her bag tag, Clara made her way toward the TSA security checkpoint. She moved through the crowds with practiced ease, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. As she joined the pre-check line, she couldn't help but notice a commotion a few lanes over, a passenger arguing loudly with TSA officers. Clara sighed. Traveling was stressful enough without adding conflict, and misunderstandings happened every day. She refocused on her own line. After all, she'd paid for pre-check, one of the small perks of traveling often for official duties. Rarely did she flash her Senate ID, preferring to experience what her constituents experienced. She placed her laptop, shoes, and purse into the bins, taking care with every movement. That's when she heard it, snickering. Turning slightly, Clara spotted them. Eric and Madeline, now dressed down but unmistakable, stepping up to the TSA line. They weren't working. Instead, they carried small bags, chatting quietly but watching Clara with amusement. Why are they here, Clara wondered. Then she remembered. Staff sometimes flew as non-revenue passengers to reposition or take advantage of flight benefits. Still, their eyes stayed locked on her like predators circling prey. Then came the whispers, cruel, loud enough for her to hear. "First class, huh?" Madeline sneered. "Did you see that old carry-on? Looks like it's from a thrift store." She laughed. Eric smirked. "Yeah, bet she scammed an upgrade or something. No way someone like that belongs up there with the business crowd." Clara's chest tightened, the words hitting harder than she expected. She could handle political attacks. Those were strategic, calculated. This was personal. This was about the color of her skin, the simplicity of her outfit, the absence of flashy jewelry or designer luggage. She took a slow, deep breath and reminded herself not everyone in Reynolds Aviation was like these two. Over the years, she'd met countless airline employees who were professional and kind. But these two, they were different, dangerous, in the way petty people can be when they think no one's watching. Still, Clara pushed forward. She would not allow two miserable souls to ruin her day or pull her down to their level. She had work waiting in Westfield City. Real work, important work. Collecting her things, Clara moved past the checkpoint. Her hands shook slightly, but she kept her head high. Senators don't shrink. With a little time before boarding, Clara found a nearby coffee shop. The terminal was packed. Families juggling toddlers, business travelers glued to their laptops, retirees studying departure screens. It was a slice of America, loud and chaotic. Clara ordered a medium latte, found a quiet corner, and pulled out her notes. She needed to prepare. The Westfield Economic Reform Committee hearing was no small thing. Bills that could change lives hung in the balance, and she'd be damned if two bullies in cheap uniforms threw her off her game. But her peace was short-lived. From across the cafe, she saw them again, Eric and Madeline, sitting 2 tables over, laughing, sipping overpriced coffees they probably got comped. Their eyes found Clara, and the grins spread across their faces like they'd just found fresh meat. Madeline leaned close to Eric, whispering something that made him snort. Clara could almost hear the words, "Who does she think she is?" And that's when Clara knew this wasn't going to stop. Not here, not at the gate, not on the plane. They were going to push this until they broke her, or until she pushed back. Clara closed her folder, hands resting calmly on the table. They didn't know who they were dealing with. And when the time came, she wouldn't just push back. She would crush them with nothing more than the truth. After finishing her coffee, Clara checked her watch. She still had 15 minutes before boarding at gate 12. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her things, straightened her shoulders, and headed toward the gate. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Airports were fascinating places, little crossroads of humanity where family vacations, business deals, and life-changing moments all collided in one space. Clara Johnson had always loved observing people, wondering what stories each traveler carried. Today, however, she wasn't in the mood for people watching. She found a small table tucked in the corner of the cafe, sipped her latte, and flipped through her notes. The committee hearing in Westfield City was critical. She planned to argue for increased economic support for small businesses in low-income neighborhoods, a cause that hit close to home. Clara's parents had nearly lost their auto shop during Detroit's worst economic downturn. They survived because of grit, determination, and a small loan that came just in time. Lost in thought, she barely noticed the uniformed Reynolds Aviation employee who approached until a soft voice startled her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I speak with you?" Clara looked up, guarded, but found herself staring into the kind eyes of a woman with a name tag that read Rebecca Carter. She wore a concerned expression, worlds apart from Eric and Madeline's sneers. "Of course," Clara replied, standing politely. "I just wanted to apologize for any inconvenience earlier," Rebecca began, lowering her voice. "I'm not entirely sure what happened at check-in, but I noticed Eric and Madeline laughing and whispering. Honestly, it didn't sit right with me." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you for saying that. I thought maybe I was being overly sensitive." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "No, ma'am, you weren't. I've heard complaints about those two before. Unfortunately, I don't supervise them directly, but I just wanted to let you know I saw what happened. If you need anything, I'll be stationed near Gate 12. Just come find me." Clara felt an unexpected swell of gratitude. "That's very kind of you. I'm all right for now, but I appreciate you saying something." Rebecca offered a small, sympathetic smile and slipped away into the crowd. Clara sat down slowly, letting out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Not everyone in this company was rotten. Rebecca's quiet warning, though, lingered like a storm cloud in the distance. Something about Eric and Madeline's attitude felt unfinished, like they weren't done with her yet. She returned to her notes, but the calm she'd forced earlier was gone. The pit in her stomach told her this day was far from over. 30 minutes before boarding, Clara arrived at Gate 12. The area was packed. Overhead monitors flickered with flight updates as voices filled the air. Parents chasing toddlers. Businessmen arguing over market trends. Couples mapping out their vacations. Clara found a seat by the window, her eyes drifting across the scene. She felt a brief smile tug at her lips, remembering why she loved policy work. Because behind every face was a story, a struggle, a dream. And the decisions she made back in Westfield could change lives. But her peace evaporated the moment she saw them, Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks, walking toward the gate podium. Her stomach dropped. There they were, as if summoned by the universe itself, their expressions bored, their body language dismissive. Eric tapped lazily on the computer while Madeline leaned in, whispering something that sent them both into stifled laughter. It didn't take long for them to notice Clara. Eric nudged Madeline, nodding towards her. Madeline rolled her eyes, smirking as she looked Clara up and down, like she was a piece of gum stuck to her shoe. Clara lowered her gaze to her notes, pretending not to notice. But her pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at her to walk over there, demand respect. But no, not yet. She'd spent a lifetime learning when to strike and when to wait. Now, she would wait. A few minutes later, Eric's monotone voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Attention passengers. Reynolds Aviation Flight 1081 to Westfield City will begin pre-boarding shortly. Passengers with disabilities, families with small children, and active military, please make your way to the gate." Madeline glanced up from the computer just long enough to cast another smug look Clara's way. Clara stayed seated, forcing herself to breathe. She'd been through this drill 1,000 times. She knew better than to engage before she had to. But the gnawing sense of what was coming next made her chest tight. Pre-boarding trickled forward. parents juggling strollers, soldiers carrying duffel bags. Then came the announcement Clara dreaded. We'll now begin boarding for our first-class passengers and Reynolds Elite members. The words echoed louder than they should have. Clara stood, gathered her things, and moved toward the line, toward them. She was fourth, behind a well-dressed couple and a man in a tailored suit, talking loudly into his AirPods. From the corner of her eye, she saw Eric and Madeline tense. Their eyes narrowed. Their amusement returned. "Oh, look who's here," Madeline muttered just loud enough. Eric snickered, pretending to be busy with the manifest. The older couple ahead of Clara glanced back, sensing the tension, but turned quickly, wanting no part in whatever was unfolding. Eric cleared his throat and stared directly at Clara as she reached the podium. "Miss Johnson, is it?" His tone dripped with condescension. Clara met his gaze evenly. "That's correct." Madeline leaned in dramatically, squinting at the screen. "Huh. First class. Interesting. Is there a problem?" Clara's voice was calm but ice cold. Eric exchanged a glance with Madeline. "Just double-checking. Wouldn't want anyone boarding who shouldn't be here." Clara stiffened but said nothing. After a beat, Eric plastered on the fakest smile she'd ever seen. "You're clear. Enjoy your flight," he said, the words practically choking him. Clara held her head high, stepped past them, and down the jet bridge. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-boarding chaos, families chasing after restless toddlers, business travelers hunched over their laptops, and tired tourists leaning against their rolling suitcases. Clara Johnson stood quietly near the large window at Gate 12, gripping her briefcase and mentally preparing for what she knew was coming. The overhead screens flickered with updates, briefly showing a slight delay before a staff member corrected it. Clara barely noticed. Her eyes kept drifting back to the two figures stationed at the boarding podium, Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks, the same Reynolds Aviation employees who had treated her with outright disdain at check-in. From her vantage point, Clara watched them interact with passengers, or rather, ignore them. Eric tapped lazily at the computer while Madeline scrolled through her phone, rolling her eyes every time someone approached the counter. They shared private smirks, occasional whispers, and not once did either of them greet anyone with a smile. Twice, Clara caught them casting sideways glances her way, sizing her up like they were preparing for round two. Her stomach churned. She had dealt with tough crowds, faced senators in heated debates, and stood firm in rooms full of power-hungry men. But this felt different, more personal, because unlike political opponents, Eric and Madeline didn't know who she was. They just saw a black woman traveling alone and decided she didn't belong. Clara straightened her shoulders. She wasn't here to prove anything. But if they forced her hand, the loudspeaker crackled. Eric's monotone voice filled the gate. Passengers requiring extra time or traveling with young children may now board. Please approach the jet bridge. Mothers and fathers gathered their little ones, forming a small line. Clara exhaled slowly, knowing what came next. First-class boarding, and another confrontation. Sure enough, once families cleared, Eric leaned into the microphone again. "We will now begin boarding for our first-class passengers and Reynolds Elite members on Flight 281 to Westfield City." Madeline stood stiff beside him, scanning the crowd with a sharp gaze, as if daring anyone to step forward. Clara didn't flinch. She grabbed her carry-on, tucked her briefcase under her arm, and made her way to the first-class line. She was fourth, right behind a retired couple wearing matching beige windbreakers and a businessman juggling two phones. The line was small, exactly what Clara expected for a midday flight. As they inched forward, Clara could hear Eric and Madeline's voices grow louder, unprofessional, bitter. "Oh, look who's here," Madeline muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Eric chuckled under his breath. "Bet she thinks she's pulling something slick." The couple ahead of Clara glanced back, clearly sensing the tension, but saying nothing. Eric and Madeline scanned the first few boarding passes without issue, forcing tight smiles as they waved the other passengers through. Then, it was Clara's turn. Madeline snatched Clara's boarding pass and stared at the screen with exaggerated scrutiny, her brow furrowing as if she were reading a foreign language. Meanwhile, Eric craned his neck, openly sizing Clara up, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Johnson, is it?" Madeline asked, her tone condescending. "That's correct," Clara replied coolly, nodding once. Madeline's eyes flicked back to the screen. "First class. Interesting." Clara's jaw tensed, but her voice remained steady. "Is there a problem?" Madeline let the question hang in the air like a bad smell before flashing the fakest smile Clara had ever seen. "Oh no, no problem," she purred. "Just double-checking. Wouldn't want any mistakes." Eric chimed in, loud enough for everyone in line to hear. "Yeah, lots of folks try to sneak up to first class, thinking they won't get caught." The couple who had just boarded slowed their steps but kept moving, clearly uncomfortable. The businessman behind Clara sighed audibly, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. Clara's blood boiled. She'd spent her life breaking barriers, walking into rooms where no one expected her. But this was beyond insulting. "I assure you," she said, voice clipped, "there's no mistake." Madeline paused, savoring the moment before handing back Clara's boarding pass, slowly, almost theatrically. "Well then, enjoy your flight, Miss Johnson," she sneered. Clara took her pass without another word and strode down the jet bridge. But her heart pounded. This wasn't over. She could feel it. Once on board, she found her seat, 2A, and stored her bag overhead. The first-class cabin was peaceful, a stark contrast to the drama outside. Clara exhaled slowly, forcing herself to relax. A friendly flight attendant, Daniel Cooper, approached with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. Can I offer you something to drink? Water, juice, champagne?" Clara managed a polite smile. "Water, please." "Thank you." Daniel returned moments later, placing a chilled bottle and glass on her tray. "Let me know if you need anything," he added with a kind nod. Finally, a little professionalism, Clara thought. As other passengers trickled in, Clara tried to focus on her committee notes. But then she heard the familiar sound of laughter, low, snide. She glanced up. Eric and Madeline had boarded the plane. They weren't working. No, they'd boarded as passengers, non-revenue, staff standby. And they were grinning like they had front row seats to the show. They passed by, Madeline shooting her a wicked smirk. Clara's stomach dropped. This flight was about to get ugly. Eric and Madeline disappeared into the back, but Clara's mind raced. This wasn't random. This was targeted. She inhaled slowly, gripping the armrest. They had no idea who she was. But they were about to find out. Clara Johnson stood her ground, refusing to rise to the bait. She had purchased this first-class seat fair and square, just like any professional needing space and peace to prepare for work. The insinuation that she didn't belong here gnawed at her, but she kept her face composed. Eric Simmons made a show of squinting at the digital manifest, tapping keys as if digging for dirt. "Huh, that's interesting," he mumbled, loud enough for the others in line to hear. He leaned toward Madeline Brooks, pretending to whisper, but his voice carried just enough for Clara to catch every word. "We should be careful about letting people slip into first class who don't actually belong here." Clara's jaw tightened. The humiliation burned, but she kept her tone even. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" she asked sharply. Madeline froze for a moment, caught off guard, but then she forced a syrupy smile. "Oh, no problem, Miss Johnson," she crooned, handing the boarding pass back as if it were contaminated. "We just need to confirm that you paid for the seat, rather than upgrading with miles or other arrangements." Her voice dripped with implication. Clara's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? I booked this seat through my frequent flyer account like anyone else. Paid the full difference for first class. It's all there in your system. Madeline gave a lazy wave, her expression smug. I'm sure it's fine, she said. You'd be surprised how many folks try to sneak their way into first class, though. Eric snorted. Gotta watch out for those free riders, he sneered, emphasizing the words like a dagger. The businessman behind Clara cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably. Even the older couple who had just boarded hovered nearby, pretending not to eavesdrop but clearly intrigued by the unfolding scene. Clara inhaled deeply, channeling every lesson her father ever taught her. Hold your head high. Don't let them see you sweat. Slowly, she straightened her shoulders. I assure you, she said firmly. There's no free riding here. Madeline shrugged theatrically, drawing out the motion before handing back the boarding pass. Well then, by all means, enjoy your flight, she sneered, making it sound like anything but a genuine wish. Clara swallowed the retort burning on her tongue. Not here. Not yet. Clutching her carry-on, she moved forward determined. She dealt with prejudice before. Her whole life had prepared her for moments like this. But she also knew if they pushed her any further, she wouldn't hesitate to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Walking down the jet bridge, Clara's stomach churned with frustration. Keep focused, she reminded herself. She had a job waiting in Westfield, a committee hearing that demanded her full attention. But she wouldn't let these two ruin her day. If they push again, she promised herself, I'll push back harder. At the aircraft door, Clara was greeted by a kind-faced flight attendant whose name tag read Daniel Cooper. Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome aboard. The warmth in his voice was a balm on her frayed nerves. Clara managed a polite smile. Thank you. He stepped aside, allowing her into the bright, spacious first-class cabin of the Boeing 737. The plush seats gleamed under the cabin lights, offering a rare pocket of comfort in an otherwise exhausting day. Clara found seat 2A, stowed her carry-on, and settled in. Her phone buzzed with messages from her staff, updates about the committee hearing, reminders about the legislative packet, but she ignored them for the moment. She could still feel Eric and Madeline's sneering glances like a weight pressing on her back. Daniel reappeared by her seat, his tone still kind. Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff? Water, juice, champagne? Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Just water, please. Thank you. Daniel returned moments later with a chilled bottle and a cup. If you need anything at all, ma'am, just let me know. Thank you, Daniel, Clara replied, grateful that someone on this flight knew how to do their job with respect. As she took a sip of water, she spotted Madeline's face peeking into the cabin from the door, smirking. Clara's stomach sank. They weren't done, not by a long shot. Passengers continued filing in. Business travelers, a young mother with a toddler, even a few familiar faces from the boarding area. Clara tried to focus on her notes, but her mind kept drifting. A flash of movement caught her eye. Eric and Madeline, stepping into the cabin, her heart dropped. They weren't done harassing her. They were boarding as passengers, probably standby, non-revenue, and they looked far too pleased with themselves. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line as they strutted past her row, Eric sneering, Madeline smirking. They took seats further back, but not so far that they couldn't still see her. They're testing me, Clara thought grimly, pushing to see how far they can go. Daniel passed by again, noting Clara's stiff posture. Everything all right, ma'am? Clara forced a smile. It will be, thank you. But the truth was, her patience was wearing thin. Eric and Madeline didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. Clara took a steadying breath, her mind sharpening. If they pushed 1 inch further, she'd show them exactly what real power looked like. Clara sat quietly in seat 2A, grateful that at least Daniel Cooper, the flight attendant, treated her with respect. As the first-class cabin slowly filled, she spotted a few familiar faces from the gate. A couple of business travelers, a young couple on what looked like a honeymoon, and a mother gently rocking her fussy infant. Just as she took a sip of water, she froze. Out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw them, Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks, stepping into the first-class cabin. For a moment, she convinced herself they were just there for last-minute coordination with the crew. After all, it wasn't unusual for gate agents to board briefly, but no, their body language was too deliberate. They weren't here to help. They were here for her. Clara lowered her gaze, pretending to check her phone, but her peripheral vision stayed locked on them. She watched as Madeline leaned in close to Daniel, whispering something quickly. Daniel's expression shifted from pleasant to troubled, his eyes flicking toward Clara. Eric stood behind Madeline, arms crossed, his smirk visible even from several feet away. Daniel held up a hand, motioning for calm, but Madeline's voice rose just enough that Clara could catch the edge of her tone. Whatever she was pushing, she wasn't letting it go. Finally, Daniel nodded reluctantly and walked toward Clara's seat, his face flushed with discomfort. "Miss Johnson," he said softly, though his voice carried enough that nearby passengers began to glance over. Clara looked up, instantly alert. She could feel the tension around her thickening. "Yes," she replied, her voice controlled. Daniel leaned in, dropping his tone. "They're concerned about your boarding pass," he whispered, eyes darting toward Eric and Madeline. "They're claiming there's an issue that they need to verify you're actually booked in first class." Clara's lips parted in disbelief. "I already showed my pass at the gate. Why is this being questioned now?" Daniel winced. "I know, ma'am. I'm so sorry. They're saying there's an error on the manifest. They insist I double-check." His eyes begged for understanding. He clearly hated being caught in the middle of this. Jaw clenched, Clara reached for her phone. "Fine," she ground out. She pulled up her boarding pass from the Reynolds Aviation app and handed it to Daniel. He scanned it with his handheld device. A soft beep confirmed the match. "She's fine," Daniel said, his voice firmer now as he turned toward Eric and Madeline. 2A is confirmed. No errors. Madeline's eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. Eric simply shook his head, still unconvinced. Clara inhaled deeply, biting back the anger, rising like wildfire. "Stay calm," she told herself, just a little longer. Despite Daniel's confirmation, Eric and Madeline didn't leave. Instead, they lingered in the aisle, drawing confused looks from other passengers. Gate agents never stayed this long. Something was off. Clara noticed another flight attendant, an older woman named Natalie Parker Reynolds, approach Madeline quietly. "Is there a situation?" she asked. Madeline waved her off, voice clipped. "Just making sure everything's in order." Clara's fists curled tightly in her lap. Making sure everything's in order? She had done absolutely nothing to deserve this scrutiny, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. It wasn't a simple clerical error. Clara knew prejudice when she saw it, and this was personal. Across the cabin, whispers started. Clara could feel the eyes, businessmen, couples, even the young mother glancing her way. To anyone watching, it might look like she had done something wrong. For a brief moment, Clara was torn. Part of her wanted to pull out her Senate ID right then and there to shut this down. But another part resisted. Why should I have to prove my worth? Shouldn't basic courtesy be enough? The cabin door finally sealed shut with a loud thud. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Reynolds Aviation Flight 1081 to Westfield City. Flight time today is approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes, weather permitting." And still, Eric and Madeline stood there. Finally, they turned to leave. But not before Madeline shot Clara one last smirk and shook her head like Clara was nothing more than a nuisance. Eric leaned toward her, whispered something, and the two chuckled as they disappeared down the aisle. Clara sat frozen, simmering with anger. As the plane taxied away from the gate, she looked out the window at the sprawling airfield. Dozens of planes lined the tarmac, each carrying strangers with their own stories, their own struggles. All those people, and somehow, she was the one being singled out. Their job is to make this easier, she thought bitterly, not harder. Daniel and Natalie Parker moved through the safety demonstration, but Clara barely registered it. Her mind was racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every muscle in her body felt like it was wound tight, ready to snap. Clara inhaled deeply, counting each breath. Focus on the mission, she reminded herself. She had important work waiting in Westfield, economic reforms that could change lives. She couldn't let these two small-minded people distract her. Yet a quiet fury settled in her chest. If Eric and Madeline thought this was over, they were dead wrong. Clara Johnson had held her composure for as long as she could, but when the intercom crackled with Linda's nervous voice calling Daniel Cooper to the forward galley, Clara knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She watched Daniel excuse himself mid-service, his shoulders tense as he made his way toward the front. Unable to resist, Clara subtly turned her head and felt her stomach drop. Standing next to Natalie Parker were the last two people she wanted to see, Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks. Somehow, against every airline protocol, they were back. She'd assumed they'd left after takeoff. Gate agents didn't stay on board. But here they were, smug, defiant, and ready to finish what they started. Clara unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the curious glances from nearby passengers. She'd had enough. Enough humiliation, enough disrespect. If they wanted a confrontation, she'd meet them head on. By the time she reached the galley, Daniel looked relieved to see her, while Madeline stiffened and crossed her arms. Eric stood with that same arrogant grin, daring Clara to challenge him. "Is there a problem?" Clara's voice was sharp but measured, the kind of tone that silenced a room. Madeline's jaw clenched. "Yes, we believe your documentation is fraudulent." She didn't even blink as she held up her phone, displaying something to Daniel. "There's no record of a Clara Johnson of your background paying for a first-class seat." She said background like it was a slur. Eric jumped in, his tone dripping with condescension. "Why don't you just come clean, ma'am? How did you get this seat?" Clara's breath caught, rage surging so strong it almost made her tremble. In all her years of public service, she'd faced political attacks, smear campaigns. But this was personal. It was prejudice, and it was happening 1,000 feet in the air. Daniel tried to step in. "I've scanned her boarding pass. It's valid. Everything matches." But Madeline brushed him aside. "Oh, please. Anyone can fake a boarding pass with the right software. Show us real ID, Miss Johnson. Right now." The last of Clara's patience snapped. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her handbag. Her fingers brushed past her regular driver's license, what they expected to see, and landed on something far more powerful. The smooth leather pouch housing the one thing that could obliterate every ounce of smugness from their faces. Her United States Senate identification. For a moment she paused. Clara had never liked flaunting her position. She'd worked too hard, come too far from her humble beginnings in Maple Heights, Michigan, to needlessly flash her title. But they'd pushed her, and they'd crossed the line. Clara held the Senate ID high enough for everyone, Madeline, Eric, Daniel, Linda, to see. The official seal of the United States Senate gleamed under the cabin lights. "You want proof?" Her voice didn't waver. "I'm Senator Clara Johnson, representing the state of Michigan. This is my identification." For the first time since this ordeal began, complete silence fell over the galley. Madeline's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The smirk drained from Eric's face, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. He glanced from the ID to Clara's face and back again, like his brain couldn't compute the reality in front of him. Daniel blinked hard, his expression shifting to something between awe and guilt. Even Natalie Parker gasped, a hand flying to her chest. Clara's gaze hardened. "You've harassed me since check-in. You questioned my integrity. You accused me of fraud and singled me out because of your assumptions. Now that you know exactly who I am, would either of you care to explain yourselves?" Madeline opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Eric, pale and visibly sweating now, stammered, "W- We, we didn't know." "That's the point," Clara snapped. "You didn't know, but it didn't stop you from treating me like a criminal, from mocking me, from humiliating me in front of your coworkers in this entire cabin." The galley felt suffocating now, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Daniel finally found his voice. "Senator Johnson, I'm so sorry. I'll inform the captain immediately." Clara gave a curt nod. "See that you do. And when we land, I expect to speak with a senior representative from Reynolds Aviation." This ends today. Madeline stood frozen, her face flushed with shame. Eric swallowed hard, looking everywhere but at Clara. Passengers nearby had caught enough to know something was going down. Clara saw heads peeking into the aisle, felt the ripple of whispers spreading. And for once, she didn't care. "I suggest you both leave my sight," Clara added coldly, "before you embarrass yourselves any further." Daniel moved swiftly, ushering Eric and Madeline out of the galley. Clara stood there for a moment, willing her breathing to steady, forcing herself not to shake. She'd fought battles before, but this was one she'd make sure ended the right way. The plane continued soaring through the clouds, but Clara knew when they landed, the real reckoning would begin. Clara Johnson stood tall, her senator ID gleaming in the cabin light, the unmistakable seal of the United States Senate silencing the galley. Madeline Brooks and Eric Simmons looked as if the floor might open beneath them. Madeline's mouth moved, but no sound came out, while Eric's wide eyes darted between Clara's face and the ID. We had no idea," Eric stammered, his voice shaky. Clara's eyes narrowed. Her tone was cold, controlled, but beneath the surface, her anger simmered. "No, you didn't, and that's exactly the problem." She took a deliberate step closer. "You didn't know who I was, yet you treated me with open contempt. Your personal biases have no place in an airline that claims professionalism and respect." The entire galley held its breath. Daniel Cooper, the flight attendant, cleared his throat, eyes glued to the ID in Clara's hand. The authenticity was undeniable. "Senator Johnson," he began softly, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry this happened on my flight. We value your patronage, and more importantly, we value every passenger's right to feel safe and respected. I'll inform the captain immediately." Madeline stood frozen, her cheeks flushed crimson. Eric swallowed hard, eyes glued to the floor, his earlier arrogance shattered. Natalie Parker Reynolds, another flight attendant, hovered nearby, nervously twisting a napkin in her hands, unsure how to de-escalate the disaster unfolding. Clara tucked her Senate ID back into her purse with calm finality. "Yes, Daniel, inform the captain, and when we land, I expect to speak with a senior manager from Reynolds Aviation." This ends today. Daniel nodded and rushed toward the cockpit, his face a mask of guilt and determination. Madeline and Eric stayed frozen, exchanging frantic whispers, their earlier bravado evaporating like mist under the sun. Clara stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch, her heart pounding, but her face composed. She could almost hear her father's voice in her head, Samuel Johnson, the man who taught her that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm while the world burns around you. Nearby passengers had noticed. Whispers rippled through the rows, curious eyes peering from behind seats. More than a few gasped when the word senator reached their ears. Clara wasn't surprised. Once her identity was out, there was no turning back. It was no longer just about her. She knew she had just become the voice for everyone who'd ever been mistreated, overlooked, or judged because of how they looked. Moments later, Daniel returned, his face pale. "Senator Johnson, the captain would like a word with you in the forward galley." Clara nodded. As she walked past Madeline and Eric, she caught a flicker of shame on their faces, but felt no sympathy. Not anymore. In the narrow corridor, Henry Crawford waited, a seasoned professional with a crisp uniform and a steady gaze. Senator Johnson, she began, voice low and respectful. I've been briefed on the situation. Let me start by offering my sincerest apologies on behalf of Reynolds Aviation. This is completely unacceptable. Every passenger deserves respect, but especially you, ma'am. You should never have been subjected to this. Clara exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Captain, I appreciate your attention, but I need to make this very clear. This isn't just about me. I expect full accountability for Madeline and Eric. They've harassed me multiple times, on the ground and in the air. Whether I'm a senator or a school teacher, no one deserves this treatment. Captain Hernandez nodded gravely. I couldn't agree more, Senator. I'll contact operations as soon as we land. There will be a senior representative waiting for you at the gate. I give you my word. We're taking this very seriously. Just then, a jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, almost as if the universe itself punctuated Clara's demand for justice. She grabbed the galley counter, steadying herself but never breaking eye contact with the captain. Thank you. I'll return to my seat now. As she walked back down the aisle, Clara felt every pair of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with newfound respect. She saw it in their faces, a realization that this quiet, well-dressed woman wasn't just any passenger. The rest of the flight was going to be different. When Clara reached her seat, Daniel approached again, his face flushed. Senator, Madeline and Eric would like to offer an apology. They insist on speaking with you. Clara's jaw clenched. Part of her wanted to tell them where to shove their apology, but deep down she knew it wasn't just about her pride. It was about showing everyone on this plane how accountability should look. After a pause, Clara nodded. All right, but I'm not interested in excuses. Moments later, Madeline and Eric appeared like two kids dragged to the principal's office. Madeline's eyes were glassy, while Eric couldn't stop shifting uncomfortably. We're really sorry, Senator Johnson, Eric began, his voice cracking. It was a misunderstanding. The manifest, it flagged something. We didn't mean any harm, Madeline jumped in, her voice shaking. Sometimes people try to sneak into first class. We didn't know who you were. Clara's gaze was ice cold. And that's the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic human decency. Did it ever occur to you to stop and think before making assumptions? Before humiliating me publicly? Madeline's lower lip trembled. Eric nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am, you're right. Clara took a deep breath. I accept your apology, but understand this. Your behavior isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. People like you are why folks hesitate to fly, why lawsuits happen, and why companies lose trust. They both nodded, their faces crimson with shame. Without another word, Clara dismissed them with a flick of her hand. Madeline and Eric shuffled away, their heads bowed. Clara sat back in her seat, heart pounding, adrenaline fading. But she knew this wasn't over. The real reckoning was still to come. On the ground, in front of corporate, where it mattered. But for now, she had reclaimed her dignity, and the entire plane knew it. Clara Johnson knew that, as a public figure, there were moments she had to handle delicate situations with grace. This was one of them. She inhaled slowly, leveling her gaze at Daniel Cooper, the flight attendant who looked at her with a mix of sympathy and tension. All right, as Clara finally said, her voice even but carrying the weight of authority. They can come here, but tell them I'm not in the mood for excuses. Daniel nodded and disappeared toward the galley. Moments later, Madeline Brooks and Eric Simmons reappeared, looking like two school kids dragged before the principal. Their earlier arrogance had crumbled, leaving only red faces and darting eyes. Madeline opened her mouth first, but no sound came out. Eric cleared his throat, staring at the floor. Senator Johnson, we're really sorry about the misunderstanding, he began awkwardly. We had some irregularities on the passenger manifest. Madeline jumped in quickly, her voice shaking. We didn't mean any harm. It's just Sometimes people try to sneak into first class. We thought someone might be using a fake identity for an upgrade. It happens, you know. Clara's stare was steady, unblinking. So you immediately assumed I was committing fraud? Based on what exactly? Madeline flushed deep red. We didn't recognize you, and your seat assignment, it flagged something in the system. That's all. Clara exhaled through her nose, suppressing the simmering anger. She'd heard these half-baked excuses before. In politics, in life, everywhere bias reared its ugly head. Whether or not you recognize me shouldn't matter, she said coolly. Every passenger deserves the presumption of honesty, especially after presenting valid credentials at check-in, at the gate, and again on board. You crossed the line from diligence into harassment. Eric grimaced, his shoulders sagging. I know. We messed up. Yes, Clara snapped. You did. Madeline looked like she was fighting back tears, but Clara couldn't tell if it was shame or just the embarrassment of being caught. We truly are sorry, Madeline whispered. We didn't know you were a United States Senator, Clara finished for her, voice sharp as glass. Does that make me more worthy of respect, Madeline? Or is it just the shock of realizing you offended someone with a high-profile title? They both stood silent, defeated. Clara let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. Well, she finally said, if you're truly sorry, perhaps you'll take a hard look at your assumptions. I accept your apology on one condition, that your behavior changes, not just toward me, but toward every passenger who looks different from what you expect. Madeline and Eric mumbled their gratitude, then slunk away, avoiding Clara's eyes. Clara sat down slowly, unclenching the tension in her shoulders. The immediate confrontation was over, but the real reckoning would come after they landed. She had no intention of letting this slide. The remainder of the flight was subdued but electric, like everyone on board could feel the undercurrent of gossip flowing. Clara could sense it. Nearly everyone in first class knew now. The whispers likely trickled back to economy. Still, the flight crew kept their professionalism. Daniel and Natalie Parker Reynolds were attentive, though their apologetic glances each time they passed Clara's seat spoke volumes. Finally, the aircraft began its descent. Henry Crawford's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Washington, D.C. Please fasten your seatbelts and return your seatbacks to the upright position. Clara stared out the window, catching the familiar sprawl of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. No matter how many times she flew in, there was always a weight to approaching the city, a reminder that this was where she fought for the people who sent her to the Senate. The plane touched down smoothly at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Relief washed over Clara. Soon she'd meet the senior manager from Reynolds Aviation and address this fiasco properly. Committee work awaited, but not until this situation was handled. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Clara's phone buzzed. Messages flooded in the moment the seatbelt sign blinked off. One text from Vanessa Reynolds, her chief of staff, made her heart sink. Heard you had a situation on your flight. Are you okay? Media inquiries are already swirling. Clara sighed deeply. News traveled fast. Someone had tipped off a reporter, or worse, passengers had posted the whole incident on social media. There was no containing this now. Passengers and economy began deplaning. Daniel approached quietly. Senator Johnson, we have a corporate manager waiting at the jet bridge to speak with you privately. Clara nodded, grabbing her briefcase and standing. She scanned the cabin. Madeline and Eric were nowhere to be seen. Hiding in the galley or already off the plane, no doubt. Natalie Parker gave Clara a small, supportive smile as she passed. Rolling her carry-on behind her, Clara exited the aircraft, the warm, humid air of D.C. hitting her instantly. Waiting just beyond the jet bridge was a sharply dressed woman with a Reynolds Aviation badge. Senator Johnson, the woman greeted, extending her hand. I'm Natalie Parker, Senior Operations Manager. First, let me apologize on behalf of Reynolds Aviation for what you experienced today. We've been briefed, and this is absolutely not the level of service we promise our passengers. Clara shook her hand firmly. Glad to hear that, because it was beyond unacceptable. In this conversation, it's not staying here. I expect formal action. Absolutely, Senator, Natalie replied quickly. Our internal review is already underway. I've pulled Madeline and Eric from duty for the rest of the day. There will be an investigation, and I'll personally ensure you're updated. We'd also like to extend a formal apology and offer to cover the cost of this flight. Clara raised an eyebrow. I don't need compensation. I need a guarantee. This doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. Natalie nodded solemnly. Understood, Senator. I give you my word. With that, Clara took a steadying breath. There was still committee work to handle, but in this moment, she'd won a different kind of battle. A reminder that respect should never depend on status, and that sometimes exposing injustice was the most powerful thing a person could do. Clara Johnson spotted a woman in a sharp navy suit, the Reynolds Aviation logo pinned neatly on her lapel. Her name tag read Rebecca Carter, Customer Relations Manager. Rachel's expression was tight with concern as she extended her hand. Senator Johnson, I'm Rebecca Carter. I'm here to address the incident that occurred on your flight. Clara took the handshake, setting aside her frustration for the moment. I appreciate you meeting me here, but we need to talk about what just happened and how Reynolds Aviation intends to handle it. Rachel nodded. Of course, Senator, if you'll step this way. They moved aside from the steady flow of disembarking passengers, settling into a quiet corner near the terminal windows. The next phase of accountability was about to unfold. In the small seating area, Clara sat across from Rachel, who quickly pulled out a sleek tablet, ready to document every word. Senator Johnson, first and foremost, on behalf of Reynolds Aviation, I extend a sincere apology for any disrespect you encountered. Rachel's voice was calm but firm. We aim to ensure every passenger feels welcome and valued. What you experienced is absolutely not aligned with our values. Clara nodded slowly, appreciating the direct acknowledgement. Thank you, but an apology is just the first step. Madeline Brooks and Eric Simmons didn't just disrespect me. They harassed me. They questioned my legitimacy. They mocked me openly in front of other passengers before and during the flight. They only stopped when I showed them my Senate ID. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line as she tapped rapid notes on her tablet. I've reviewed the preliminary report from the flight crew, and Henry Crawford filed a statement as well. May I ask, Senator, are you filing a formal complaint or are you considering legal action? Clara's jaw tightened. I'm filing a formal complaint, absolutely. As for legal action, that depends on how Reynolds Aviation handles this. I expect real accountability. Both employees need to face disciplinary action and be required to undergo serious retraining. Rachel nodded, the flicker of tension behind her professional mask impossible to miss. Understood, Senator. I want to be very clear. Both Madeline and Eric are being placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. If we determine they violated our code of conduct, especially regarding discrimination, termination is on the table. Clara let that sink in. She wasn't here for revenge, but she knew better than anyone that real change only came with real consequences. Good. I expect a swift and fair investigation. Look, I know I'm a public figure, but this isn't about me. No passenger, senator or not, should ever be treated like that. I've dealt with racial bias my entire life, but I'm done letting it slide. Rachel looked up from the tablet, face solemn. Absolutely, Senator. I'm escalating this to our Vice President of Customer Experience. Additionally, as part of our response, we'd like to offer you a complimentary round-trip ticket or a full refund on today's flight. Clara shook her head, waving the offer off. I'm not here for freebies, Rachel. I want a culture change. The next time someone who doesn't fit the image of a first-class passenger steps on one of your planes, I expect your employees to treat them with the same respect as anyone else. Period. Rachel's shoulders sagged slightly. That's our goal too, Senator Johnson. I promise I'll keep you updated as the investigation proceeds. In the meantime, please accept our formal apology and know we are addressing this directly with senior leadership. Clara nodded, rising to her feet. Thank you, Rachel, but know this story isn't over. How Reynolds Aviation handles this will be watched closely. The meeting wrapped. Clara rolled her carry-on toward the exit, her mind already shifting back to her other battle, the one waiting for her at Capitol Hill. But she knew full well this airline fight was far from over. By the time she arrived at Capitol Hill, her phone buzzed relentlessly. Vanessa Reynolds, her chief of staff, intercepted her outside the Hart Senate office building, face tight with urgency. Senator, we have a problem. CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, everybody's reaching out. They want a statement about the airline incident. It's gone viral. Clara suppressed a groan. She'd hoped to handle it quietly, but social media had no mercy. All right, she exhaled. Let's be strategic. Set up a short press briefing after my committee hearing. I won't let this distract from the policy work, but I will make a statement. Vanessa nodded. Yes, Senator, and your hearing on economic reforms starts in 20 minutes. They'll want your opening remarks. Clara straightened her shoulders, years of political conditioning taking over. Then let's move. She walked briskly through the grand marble halls, aware of the dual battles now resting squarely on her shoulders, her fight for economic justice in low-income communities, and her personal fight against the quiet, insidious racism she'd faced at 35,000 feet. The cameras would be waiting, but Clara Johnson was ready. Clara Johnson had come to Capitol Hill that morning prepared to focus on economic reform, but the incident on Reynolds Aviation Flight 1081 had thrust her into an unexpected spotlight, a fight against racial discrimination in air travel. Standing tall before the Senate committee, she delivered her prepared remarks with grace and unwavering conviction. Clara passionately advocated for economic measures aimed at uplifting small businesses, particularly in struggling communities like the one she grew up in back in Detroit. Her words were powerful, personal, and deeply rooted in her life's mission. But the moment the hearing concluded, the room erupted into a frenzy. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved inches from her face. Senator Johnson, is it true you were harassed by Reynolds Aviation staff? Did you really have to show your Senate ID just to prove you belonged in first class? Are you planning to sue the airline? Clara held up a hand, commanding silence. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, but impossible to ignore. Yes, there was an incident. 2 employees of Reynolds Aviation singled me out. They questioned my right to sit in first class despite my valid ticket. While I am disappointed, I can't say I'm shocked. Racial bias is real, and it shows up in places you least expect, even at 35,000 feet. She took a breath and continued. I've filed a formal complaint, and I have faith Reynolds Aviation will handle this. But this moment is bigger than me. My focus is ensuring that every passenger, regardless of skin color, background, or status, can travel without facing discrimination. That's what matters most. The press barrage intensified, but Clara refused to let the media circus drown out her purpose. She answered only what was necessary, refusing to let this overshadow her legislative work. Yet deep down, she recognized the power of this moment, how speaking out could shine a light on the quiet discrimination so many endured but couldn't fight back against. As Clara stepped away from the crowd, her phone buzzed. An email from Rebecca Carter, Reynolds Aviation's customer relations manager. The subject line was simple: update on investigation. Clara read quickly. Madeline Brooks and Eric Simmons had been suspended, pending further investigation. Karma had arrived. Still, Clara knew this was just the first step. Real accountability had to follow. 2 days later, Clara woke to headlines splashed across every major news outlet. Reynolds Aviation staff suspended after harassing Black U.S. Senator cable news pundits debated whether it was an isolated incident or a symptom of deeper, systemic bias in the airline industry. Social media boiled over with outrage, many sharing their own experiences of being profiled while traveling. Clara stayed grounded, refusing to get caught up in the spectacle. Her focus remained on her work, but she kept one eye on the airline's next move. Late that afternoon, the call finally came. Senator Johnson, it's Rebecca Carter. I have important updates. Go ahead, Rachel. Rachel took a steadying breath. Our internal investigation confirmed that both Madeline Brooks and Eric Simmons have a record of unprofessional conduct, including prior complaints for rudeness and disrespect. Their actions toward you were blatant violations of our corporate policies, particularly around discrimination and harassment. Clara's back straightened. And the outcome? They've both been terminated, Senator. Rachel's voice was somber. It wasn't a decision we made lightly, but the evidence left no doubt. Witnesses confirmed their behavior throughout the flight. Additionally, Reynolds Aviation is launching a mandatory diversity and inclusion refresher training company-wide. Every customer-facing employee will be required to attend starting next week. Clara exhaled slowly, absorbing it all. Though she never sought to destroy anyone's livelihood, she knew true accountability required consequences. I appreciate the swift action, Rachel. I only hope this sends a clear message, not just within Reynolds Aviation, but across the entire industry. Discrimination has no place anywhere, especially not at 35,000 feet. Rachel's voice carried a note of cautious optimism. That's exactly our goal, Senator. And if you're willing, we'd like your input on how to strengthen our training going forward. Clara allowed herself a faint smile, though Rachel couldn't see it. I'll consider it. Thank you for the update. As she ended the call, Clara couldn't ignore the bitter irony. Had Madeline and Eric simply treated her like any other passenger, none of this would have happened. But their bias, casual, unchecked, had cost them everything. The final wave of karma came days later when local news aired an interview with a tearful Madeline Brooks. Voice trembling, she claimed she'd never meant to be racist. She just assumed Clara couldn't afford first class. Social media lit up like wildfire. Viewers weren't buying it. That's exactly the problem, one viral tweet read. The assumption that a Black woman doesn't belong. That's racism, whether you meant it or not. Through it all, Clara stayed focused. This was never about revenge. It was about fairness, about justice, for herself and for every person who'd been made to feel like they didn't belong. As she gazed out over Washington, D.C., in the city where she fought every day for her constituents, Clara felt the quiet satisfaction of a battle won, not out of anger, but out of righteous purpose. Some stories take flight in ways we never expect. For Senator Clara Johnson, what began as a routine trip from Chicago to D.C. became a stark reminder. Prejudice can lurk in the most ordinary places. In the end, Clara's quiet strength and unwavering determination brought swift consequences and a powerful wake-up call. For businesses, for individuals, for us all, it's time we check our biases. It's time we ensure every traveler, whether a senator or a school teacher, gets the respect they deserve. Thank you for following this story. If Senator Johnson's stand against injustice resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Justice deserves an audience. This story is a powerful reminder that respect and dignity are not privileges reserved for a select few. They are basic rights that should be extended to every person, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what seat they're sitting in. What happened to Senator Clara Johnson wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger issue that many people face every single day. How many times have good, hard-working folks been judged the moment they walk through a door, step onto a plane, or simply exist in a space where others think they don't belong. Whether it's because of race, gender, age, or social class, that instant judgment carries weight. It wounds, it diminishes, and it reminds us just how far we still have to go when it comes to truly living by the values we claim to hold. What makes Clara's story so meaningful isn't just the fact that she's a senator. It's the way she handled it, with grace, strength, and a quiet determination that forced people to stop and think about their own actions. She could have lashed out. She could have made a scene, but instead she chose to stand tall, to let the truth and the facts speak for themselves, and to demand accountability the right way. And that's the real lesson here. Not every fight needs to be loud or explosive to be powerful. Sometimes the most impactful stand you can take is the one where you refuse to let someone else's small-mindedness define you. Clara's experience also shines a light on the importance of companies, especially those in positions of power and service, taking a hard look at their own culture. It's not enough to slap a diversity statement on a website or run a one-time training. Real change happens when people at every level are held accountable for their behavior, when bias is called out, and when those in charge aren't afraid to say, "This is not who we are, and we will fix it." For anyone watching this story and feeling a spark of recognition, whether you've been on the receiving end of that look, that tone, or that dewat, I hope you remember Clara Johnson. I hope you remember that you're not alone and that sometimes when the world tries to put you in a box, the best thing you can do is step out of it boldly and remind everyone exactly who you are. Respect isn't earned by proving your worth over and over again. It should be given because you're human, because you're here, and because in this country, no one should ever have to show a title just to be treated like they belong. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever witnessed or experienced something like what Senator Johnson went through, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more people hear stories like this. Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been judged before people knew who you really were? Let's talk about it down there. And hey, share this video with your friends and family, because these are the conversations we need to be having. And of course, if you enjoy real stories that shine a light on injustice and end with karma served, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more coming your way. Thanks for watching, and remember, respect should be for everyone, not just the people you think deserve it.